Welcome to the lecture on Materialism, which is chapter 13. This lecture is a two-part lecture on materialism. The second part of the lecture will also highlight some key parts of chapter 14, modernism. This is the last information that we're going to be getting from the textbook that we cover this semester. Remember that we started with early civilizations and we've made our way all the way from that point to the more modern period in humanities. What a journey we've taken. And I hope you've not only learned some things, but maybe you also developed an appreciation for the humanities. Maybe you even discovered a certain art form that you'll continue to experience and share for the remainder of your life. So let's get started. After the 1850s, the industrial technologies of steam, power, coal, and iron brought the West into a position of dominance over those less industrialized parts of the world. Electricity, synthetic paints, and photography provided new ways of viewing one's natural surroundings and recording everyday experiences. Building methods improve as cast iron and mass production aid the building methods and designs. So when we talk about materialism, it's actually it incorporates two major movements in the art, realism and Impressionism, and we'll be talking about each of these movements. Both called for an objective and unidealized record of the physical world, the bitter realities of lower class life, and those pleasures that were pleasures and pastimes, of the urban scene. France is the center of the Western artistic productivity, and Paris, France, became a melting pot for artists and composers and writers. So following the last Impressionist show in 1886, a rich assortment of expressive, exotic, and formal post-Impressionist styles brought the century to a close. London and Paris hosted the world fairs that introduced the cultures of those non-Western nations to many astonished Europeans. So for the first time, the arts of Japan and Africa and Oceania have a visible impact on the culture of the West. So industrialism provided that economic and military basis for the West's rise to dominion over the rest of the world. The railroad was the most important technological phenomenon of the early 19th century. The railroad combined technologies of steam power, coal, and iron, which helped the railroad facilitate economic and political expansion. Now, before the end of the 19th century, Western technology included the internal combustion engine, the telegraph, the telephone, the camera, and electricity. We had that first light bulb by Thomas Edison, and this provided a sharper perception of reality that, along with the camera, is going to help shatter the world of romantic illusion. Technology accelerated that tempo of everyday life, and it drew attention to the role of the senses in defining the experience. Processed steel, aluminum, and the steam turbine, not to mention the pneumatic tire, these were all products of the 1880s, further altering the texture of life in that industrialized world. This gave Europe clear advantages over other parts of the globe, and it facilitated the Western imperialism in less industrially developed areas. So you see a picture there of a factory at the top left representing that industrial era. We see the railroad picture on the right. Again, the railroad is going to be what we've called a game changer, right? I mean, you can get people from one location to another, goods and services from one place to another. And so there's that increase in economic and political expansion. All right, so between approximately 1500 and 1800, Europeans established these trading outposts in Africa, China, and India. After 1800, in the wake of that industrial revolution we were talking about, European imperialism transforms the territories of foreign people into outright colonial possessions that are driven by the more powerful countries' need for raw material and markets for their manufactured goods. And Great Britain, as you know, was the most powerful of those colonial and imperialistic kind of ideals. So when you think of, imperialism, you've got countries like Great Britain that will go into another country and to get their goods and raw materials, right? And because they're a more powerful country, they can impose their rule on that country. So Great Britain had a lot of these places that they had imposed imperial rule. The most dramatic example of the new imperialism was in Africa. By 1900, all of Africa except Ethiopia and Liberia had been carved up by European powers who introduced new models of political and economic authority, often with little regard for the indigenous populations. So they weren't concerned about the indigenous people in that location. It was more about imposing their control and trying to bend the will of the people to follow their lead. By the 19th century, the U.S. itself, a colony of Britain until 1776, had joined the scramble for economic control. They forced Japan to open its doors to Western trade in 1853. This event marked the beginning of the Japanese modernization under the Meiji rule. In the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. established its own overseas empire. North Americans used the phrase manifest destiny to describe justify the policy of unlimited expansion into the American West, Mexico, and elsewhere. The result was the U.S.'s acquisition of the more than half of Mexico, the control of the Philippines and Cuba, and a dominant position in the economies of the politically unstable nations of Latin America. The gift of progress did not always have some negative consequences. It marked the decline in most of the colonial territories in productivity and originality. The full effects of Western colonialism would not be clear until later in the 20th century. So we end up with a polarized world, right? Industrialization has created this polarized world. There are those that have and those that do not. We call them the haves and have-nots. Industrialized nations themselves were being impacted. There was a change to the nature and character of human work, altered relationships between human beings, and these all also affected the natural environment. So after the turn of the century, industrial production, enhanced by advances in machine technology, came to be controlled by a relatively small group of middle-class entrepreneurs. Now, an entrepreneur is someone who organizes, manages, and assumes the risk of a business, and by an even smaller number of capitalists, those who provide money to finance business. So industrial production is being controlled by this small group of people that are entrepreneurs and capitalists. Industrialization created wealth, but that wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small minority of the population. The vast majority of men and women lived hard lives supported by meager wages. The only thing they had to sell was women and children were among factory laborers who worked under dirty and dangerous conditions for long hours. Sometimes they worked up to 16 hours a day. And most of us complain about an 8-hour workday, right? Beginning in 1848, the lower classes were protested against these conditions with sporadic urban revolts. Social criticism was inevitable. So from about 1830, the writers described these conditions with embellished objectivity. This unblinking attention to contemporary life and experience was the basis for the style known as literary realism. Okay, so when we talk about literary realism, we're talking about writing that focuses on the realistic view or portrayal of life. The 19th century novel, through its capacity to detail characters and conditions, fulfilled that realist credo of depicting life with complete candor. This was in direct contrast to what we knew about Romanticism, which, remember, it embraced those heroic and exotic subjects, a idealized kind of view. This is not. Realism is real, okay? And it's going to focus on real life, the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will. Realism portrayed men and women in actual, everyday, and often demoralizing situations. It examined the social consequences of the middle-class materialism, the plight of the working class, and the subjugation of women, among other topics. Charles Dickens is probably one of the most popular English novelists of his time. He came from a very poor family who provided him with little formal education. So these early experiences of Dickens supplied some of the themes for his most famous novels. Novels like Oliver Twist, he wrote in 1838. This vividly portrays the slums, the orphanages, and the boarding schools of London. Nicholas Nickleby is another famous novel by Dickens. He wrote it in 1839. It was a bitter indictment of England's brutal rural schools. And another famous work, David Copperfield, he wrote in 1850. And in David Copperfield, he condemns the debtors' prisons and the conditions that produced them. In fact, Dickens' father would find himself in debtor's prison. If you couldn't afford to pay your bills, they would throw you in debtor's prison. Dickens' novels are frequently theatrical. One of the most famous, that people see during the holiday season is A Christmas Carol with Ebenezer Scrooge, that story. So his novels are frequently theatrical. They're things that you would actually find the characters being drawn to the point of almost absurdity or caricature. And his themes often suggest a sentimental faith in kindness and good cheer as being the best antidotes to the bitterness of contemporary life. Another famous writer that we know as Mark Twain, he's an American writer. His real name was Samuel Langhorne Clemens. He's an American writer who set his stories in the rural farmlands along the Mississippi River in the South. Twain shared Charles Dickens' sensitivity to pictorial detail, but he brought to his writing a unique blend of humor and irony. We know the famous novel by Mark Twain, The Adventures of Huck Finn, written in 1884. This is the most widely taught book in American literature. It was published as a sequel to the popular boys' book, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, that he had written in 1876, which, like Dickens' novels, appeared in serial format. The novel recounts the exploits of the young narrator, Huck Finn, and the runaway slave Jim, as the two make their way down the Mississippi River on a ramshackle raft. Huck is a poor, ignorant, poor, ignorant, but good-hearted Southern white boy who experiences a crisis of conscience when he has to choose between helping a fugitive slave, which was a felony offense in the slave states of the South, and obeying the law by turning over his older friend and companion to the local authorities. In opting to help Jim escape, Huck is, in effect, an accomplice to a crime by Southern standards. Nevertheless, he chooses to help aid Jim, the man, even as he violates the law in harboring Jim, the slave. As a humorist, novelist, journalist and social critic, Twain offered his contemporaries a blend of entertainment and vivid insight into the troubled relations between blacks and whites in the American South just prior to that Civil War. These he captures in an exotic blend of dialects, the vernacular rhythms and idioms of local untutored speech. Russian realism in literature. There were Russian novelists Fyodor Dostoevsky and Leo Tolstoy who were more pessimistic than we saw in Dickens or Twain, and they were more profoundly analytic of the universal human condition. Both of these men were born and bred in wealth, but both turned against the upper class Russian society and sympathized with the plight of the lower classes. Tolstoy renounced his wealth and property and went to live and work among peasants. His historical novel War and Peace, which was a huge success, and it's also a very large book to read, was written in 1869. It is the greatest example of realistic Russian fiction. It traces that progress of 5 families whose destinies unroll against the background of Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. This novel exposed the privileged position of the nobility and the cruel exploitation of the great masses of Russian people. Dostoevsky pays greater attention than Tolstoy to philosophical and psychological issues. His characters are often victims of a dual plight, like poverty and conscience. Dostoevsky spent 5 years at hard labor, and the necessity of suffering is a central theme in his writing, as in the hope of salvation through suffering. Both his novels, Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov, treat matters of guilt and penitence and the psychological consequences of moral freedom. In other words, he probes that human conscience. So 2 important writers during the Russian realism in literature. Literary realism and drama. Henrik Ibsen, and you see his picture on the slide there, was a Norwegian dramatist who brought to the late 19th century stage concerns similar to those in the novels of the realists. Ibsen rebelled against the artificial social conventions that led people to pursue self-deluding and hypocritical lives. He shocked the public by writing prose dramas that addressed such controversial subjects as insanity, incest, and venereal disease. He also explored the universal themes of conflict between the individual and society, between love and duty, and between husband and wife. One of his famous plays, and I love teaching this play, is A Doll's House. This is a landmark drama of female liberation. It traces the awakening of a middle-class woman to the meaninglessness of her role as a doll wife, living in a doll's house. Threatened with blackmail over a debt she incurred years earlier, that main female character, Nora Helmer, looks to her priggish, egotistical husband, Torvald, for protection. When he fails to rally to her defense, she realizes the frailty of her dependent lifestyle. She comes to recognize that her first obligation is to herself and to her dignity as a human being. Her self-discovery precipitates the end of the marriage. She shuts the door on past illusions as emphatically as Ibsen may have said to have turned his back on romantic ideals. Ibsen insists that the responsibility of the playwright is not to answer the questions for the audience, but to ask them. So he ends the play without disclosing the outcome of Nora's decision to leave her husband and children, and in doing so, he is a man before his time. Late 19th century architecture. So some exciting things are going on in architecture. The use of the new structural medium cast iron revolutionized the history of architecture. It provided strength without a lot of bulk, and it allowed architects to span broader widths and to raise structure to greater heights than could be achieved by just traditional masonry. European architects were slow to realize its potential, even those in England. even those in England, John Nash had used cast iron in 1815 in the Brighton Pavilion. And this wasn't until 1836 that construction began on the first cast iron suspension bridge, and not until the mid-century that iron was used as a skeletal support for mills or warehouses and railroad stations. Joseph Paxton used cast iron and wrought iron and glass in his building, the Crystal Palace. And you see actually three pictures there of the Crystal Palace. Now, this was the Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture in Zurich, and it was called the Crystal Palace. It was erected for the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. This is the world's first prefabricated building and the forerunner of the functional steel and glass architecture of the 20th century. This was dismantled after the Great Exhibition was held, and it was moved to a new site. It's considered a masterpiece of prefabrication and portability, and unfortunately it burned to the ground in 1930. So remember good old Joseph Paxton, the innovator of use of iron for public buildings. And you can see the use of that, that cast iron and then the glass that's just brought in a lot of light. It's a beautiful structure. We all recognize this structure, the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower began as a novelty, but soon it became emblematic of early modernism. The viewing tower is constructed by the engineer Gustave Eiffel for the Paris World's Fair of 1889, is a tall, 1,063 feet high cast iron skeleton with elevators that offer visitors magnificent aerial views of Paris. Aesthetically, the tower linked the architectural traditions of the past with the future. Its sweeping curves, its delicate tracery, and dramatic verticality recall the glories of the Gothic cathedral, while its majestic ironwork anticipates the austere abstractions of international style architecture. So you can see the size of this building in comparison with these in the background. Look at the people walking, okay? So you've got an observation area here, here, and at the very top. Now, if you ever go to Vegas, they have a rendition of the Eiffel Tower. Now, notice this one is 10,063 feet high. The one in Vegas is half that size. It's only 500 and something feet, but amazing nonetheless. The skyscraper. Europe's ornamental structures such as the Crystal Palace and the Eiffel Tower give way to America's functional buildings or structures. The skyscraper would become the prime architectural expression of modern corporate power in the urban scene. By 1850, there were 7 American cities with more than 100,000 inhabitants. The physical character of the pre-modern city, whose buildings were no more than 4 stories high, changed enormously with the construction of skyscrapers, which were multi-storied vertical giants made possible by the advancing technology of steel. Steel was lighter, it was stronger, and it was more resilient than cast iron. Steel used as a frame could carry the entire weight of a structure, thus eliminating the need for solid, weight-bearing masonry walls. By the 1880s, the new steel frame was united with the elevator to raise structures more than 10 stories high. There's an American architect, Louis Henry Sullivan, who designed a multi-story building whose exterior proudly reflects the structural simplicity of their steel frames. Sullivan argued form should follow function. Within decades, the American skyscraper becomes this icon of modern urban culture. Now, here is a famous photograph that was taken, and there's a video that you can watch that is about the building of the skyscrapers. But this famous photo was taken, and it was entitled Lunch Atop a Skyscraper. Now, you can see how high up these men are, and they're all just sitting. just casually on this beam having their lunch. Now, I don't do heights well. I'm very afraid of being up high. So this just sets my anxiety level on overdrive. Here are some other pictures of famous skyscrapers. So you imagine we went from, say, a 4-story building, which was the norm, to building these skyscrapers, which, could be 80, 90, stories. This is the Guarantee Building in Buffalo, New York. It was designed by Sullivan and another, the Dankmar Adler was another designer on this building, along with Sullivan. The steel made possible a whole new concept of building design, characterized by lighter materials, flat roofs, and larger windows. So you see the building, as a whole. Notice how the first floor looks different than the second floor, and then these floors all look pretty, cookie cutter, the same. And then you've got some additional detail here at the top. Here's a close-up of the columns. And so you can see just, the GB for Guarantee Building. Beautiful design elements, and looking at it from up, from the ground up is just an interesting thing. Some other neat architectural details. Realism in the visual arts. Significant factors in the development of the materialist mentality was the birth of photography. In fact, it was referred to as writing with light. Paintings or engravings might bring to life the content of the artist's imagination, but a photograph offered an authentic record of the moment, vanished in time. William Henry Fox Talbot invented the fundamental negative/positive process that allowed multiple prints to be produced from a single exposure. His French contemporary was Louis J.M. Degas, who developed a different process which used a light-sensitive metal plate and fixed the image with common chemicals. The images could not be reproduced. Daguerreotype became popular. By the mid-century, both Europeans and Americans were using the camera for a wide variety of purposes. They did topographical studies of exotic geographic sites. They photographed architectural monuments of the historical past, and they produced thousands of portraits that offered ordinary people an affordable alternative to a painted portrait. So before the camera, all that was available was for you to get a portrait painted, but it was an expensive thing for you to purchase. So the camera provided a lot cheaper way for you to get a portrait. Photography liberated artists from reproducing the physical look of nature. They have this more realistic look, right? By the end of the century, the Kodak point and shoot handheld camera was produced, and this gave vast numbers of people the freedom to take their own photographic images. So think about how far we've come in photography. Now we're all walking around with a phone that has a camera, and we can take pictures all the time, right? So a lot different than the days when a portrait had to be done by painting. So this is another huge, huge landmark that comes about, and that's photography. Here you've got the William or J.M. Daguerre. You've got these pictures, okay? In fact, there was a famous documentary photographer, Matthew B. Brady, who was a Civil War photographer. So we have a lot of images from that war and the wars after that. Realism in the visual arts, painting. Realism came to challenge the Romantic style. The realist preference for concrete, matter-of-fact depictions of everyday life provided a sober alternative to both that remote, exotic, and heroic imagery of the Romantics and the noble and elevated themes of the neoclassics. So you see this beautiful painting here. You've got a bride and a groom, right? And they're walking across this board road past, these construction pipes or whatever, to get to wherever it is they're going. So a very realistic situation in an interesting sampling of, a real life scene. Gustave Courbet was a leading realist of the 19th century French painting. He was a farmer's son who was a self-taught artist. I mean, he didn't have any formal training. He taught himself to paint. He was an outspoken socialist and a staunch defender of the realist cause. In fact, he once said, "A painter should paint only what he can see." His portraits, landscapes, and contemporary scenes remain true to the tangible facts of his immediate vision. So you see a couple of his paintings here. He would paint ordinary individuals in their actual settings and circumstances. My son tells me this looks like Johnny Depp, and it really, now that's all I can see. Here you have this realistic, the hunt, right? You've got the dog that's, attacking the elk or deer, whatever this is, right? The rest of the hunting dogs, the man with the bullwhip over his head, about to, change that scene. Here's some more paintings. Courbet's most daring record of ordinary life. It consists of 52 life-size figures disposed around the edges of a freshly dug grave. So here's the scene. There's 52 life-size figures around this grave. You see the hole. The kneeling grave digger and the attendant dog are as important to this picture as the priest is and his retinue, his group of religious figures. With the objectivity of a camera eye, Courbet banished from his view all the sentimentality and the artifice, and he gets to that realistic view, okay, including the little doggy. All right, another French painter is Jean-Francois Millet, or Millet. Courbet's contemporary, that's who Jean-Francois Millet is. He's a contemporary of Courbet. He did not share Courbet's socialist zeal. Millet devoted his career to painting the everyday lives of the rural proletariat. His depictions are of hardworking farm laborers, and these depictions earned him the title, the peasant painter. The Gleaners, okay, you see right here, involves 3 peasant women being shown in the menial task of gathering the bits of grain that are left over after the harvest. He delineates these stooping laborers with ennobling simplicity. This is a landmark piece which became a symbol of the dignity of hard work, a nostalgic reference to the way of life that was quickly disappearing before encroaching industrialism. The painting has to be copied, mass-produced, and widely sold in engraved editions. So, or it has been copied. So, you see a lot. Even today, you can pick up a print of this. This one was another interesting one I found. This is Going to Work. So again, that symbol of hard work, the menial task of going to work every day. So he's realistically capturing these sorts of settings as the peasant painter that he was. Social realism in Doumer. French artist Henri Doumer left the world a detailed record of the social life of his time. He also had no formal academic education. His earliest training was in lithography, which is a printmaking process created by drawing on a stone plate. It's a cheap way of providing illustrations for newspapers, magazines, and books. The advancing technology of modern life attracted Doumer's interest. He did not just depict the facts of modern life, but instead he frequently ridiculed them or made fun of them. Being skeptical of whether new technology and social progress could radically alter the human condition, he drew attention to characteristic human weaknesses, part of the ancestors of modern day political cartoons. So let's look at his social realism. Again, remember, he was a lithographer for a Paris newspaper, for Paris newspapers and journals. His works, he works ancestral to modern day political cartoons. So here's one called The Third Carriage. Okay, so it shows you the people that are riding in the third car of the train versus those in the first class carriage. This is called The Uprising. And then here you have Battle of the Schools, idealism versus realism. So these sorts of things were kind of the precursor to the political cartoon. Scandalous realism, Edouard Manet. French painter Edouard Manet presented an unsettling challenge to the world of art. He admired the art of the old masters and was equally enthralled by contemporary life. The middle-class pleasures of his fellow Parisians were a lot of times what he captured. In 1863, he shocked the public with the large, brilliant painted canvas entitled Luncheon on the Grass, and you see that on the bottom left. This depicted a nude woman calmly enjoying a picnic lunch with two fully clothed men, while a second, partially clothed woman bathes in a nearby stream, and you may not have even noticed her in the beginning. While female nudity has been acceptable in European art since the early Renaissance, it always was cast in terms of classical myth or allegory. This doesn't fall into that category. In this, there was no barrier between fantasy and ordinary life, which made the nudity considered indecent. In that same year, Manet offered public taste with the painting Olympia, and here you have it here. Olympia features a nude woman reclining upon a chaise lounge with a black cat at her feet, and it's hard to, here's a close-up so you can see the black cat at her feet, and a black female servant behind her brandishing a bouquet of flowers. It struck viewers who flocked to see the painting as a great insult to the academic tradition. And of course it was. One could say that the artist had thrown down a gauntlet, or in modern terms, mic drop. In his painting, he depicts his favorite model, Victorine Meurent, in the guise of a traditional reclining Venus. But he replaces that idealized female image with that of an ordinary courtesan, a high-class prostitute. She's wearing satin slippers and a black ribbon at her throat. Manet's contemporary Venus stares brazenly at the beholder. So he's like breaking all the rules with this painting. And oddly enough, it gets a lot of attention to him and his painting. He's also, Edouard Manet is also famous for his captured cafe scenes that depict social life at the end of the 19th century, similar to those depicted in his paintings. So here you've got the cafe concert, okay? So someone's singing and you see people in the cafe. Here's the waitress. Okay, so very realistic views into society. This one's called boating, so it's another commonplace event, being on the boat. Here's another one that's, you know, near the boats, right? So interesting capturing of that social life, okay, at the end of the 19th century. American realist painters, Eakins and Homer. There is a period called the Gilded Age, and that's the late 19th century. This was an era of gross materialism. During this time, Americans produced an extraordinary number of first-rate realist painters. One of those is Thomas Eakins. He's a Philadelphia artist who spent 4 years of study in Europe, but ultimately emerged as a painter of the American scene and as an influential art instructor. He was criticized for his insistence on working from nude models. He's among the first artists to choose subjects from the world of sports, such as boxing and boating. His fascination with scientific anatomy, dissected cadavers at Jefferson Medical College in Philly, led him to produce some unorthodox representations of medical training and practice. In this painting you see at the top left, this one is Eakin's The Agnew Clinic is the title of it. It's a dispassionate view of a hospital amphitheater in which a doctor lectures to students on the subject of a surgical procedure. So you see the students in the background. You see in this circle, you've got the patient being operated on, and here is the doctor lecturing to the students on how to perform that surgery. Winslow Homer is another famous artist from American realist artist. Winslow Homer is regarded by many as the greatest American painter of the 19th century. He began as a newspaper illustrator and reporter. He was the first professional artist to serve as a war correspondent. He painted subjects both ordinary and typically American. While his genre paintings reflect a fascination with the activities of American women and children, he was interested in the role of African Americans in contemporary culture. But he was somewhat critical of visual representations that portrayed American slaves as merry and content. The Gulf Stream is the picture you see on the slide. This shows a black man adrift in a rudderless boat surrounded by shark-filled waters that are whipped by the winds of an impending tornado. Realistic in its execution, the painting could, however, be interpreted as a romantic metaphor for the isolation and plight of Black Americans in those decades following the Civil War. Now we get to one of my loves, Impressionism. Now, there was a group of young French painters that focused on the life of leisure and urban pleasures, and they flourished in the 1870s and 1880s. They did not idealize nature as the Romantics did, and while they rejected traditional themes from history, literature, and religion in favor of more contemporary scenes, as did the realists, they do not record reality with clinical objectivity. They invent an art of pure perception, one that intensified the immediacy of the visual experience. Luminous canvases parallel those late 19th century research into the physics of light, the chemistry of paint, and the laws of optics. Synthetic pigments replace traditional earth pigments with brilliant new colors. These developments in science and technology contributed to the birth of a new art of light and color that critics would later call Impressionism. Now, Impressionism is going to depict the life of leisure and urban pleasure. There is that art of perception. There's an experimentation with light and color. And there's not a single uniform style associated with Impressionism. One of the most famous Impressionists and one of my favorites is Claude Monet. Monet is considered that pioneer of the Impressionist movement. Sunrise, which you see here on the bottom right, was created from a scene in the port of Le Havre. Monet depicts a mist, which provides a hazy background to the piece set in the French harbor. The orange and yellow hues contrast brilliantly with the dark vessel that you see, the boat, where little, if any, detail is immediately visible to the audience. It is striking and candid work that shows the smaller boats in the foreground almost being propelled along by the movement of the water. This has once again been achieved by separate brush strokes that also show various colors sparkling on the sea. His aim was not to create an accurate landscape, but to record the impressions formed while looking at that landscape. Another famous piece, Woman with the Parasol Facing Left, and Woman with the Parasol Facing Right. After a few pictures painted in the 60s, Monet dispensed almost entirely with figures in his works, devoting himself to landscape painting. However, when he did include large figures in his landscape paintings, and as this started to happen again in the 1880s, he treated them as if they were an element in the landscape. Around the mid-1880s, Monet reverted to the beginnings of his career as an artist and took up figure painting once more. In the two open-air studies, Woman with a Parasol Turned to the Left and Woman with the Parasol Turned to the Right, Monet was fascinated by the very low viewpoint from which the model is shown. She stands on a riverbank against a background of a pale blue sky. The woman in both pictures is Suzanne Hochet, one of the daughters of Alice Hochet, who was to become Monet's second wife in 1889. His future stepdaughter, Suzanne, was to be for a long time one of the painter's favorite models. Some quotes from Monet. Color is my day-long obsession, joy, and torment. Another one, every day I discover more and more beautiful things. It's enough to drive one mad. I have such a desire to do everything. My head is bursting with it. So constantly trying to improve his craft, constantly seeing something that could become a wonderful painting. Now, here's some other paintings by him. He was known to paint a scene multiple times and at different times of the day when the light would be different. He would coat the raw canvas with what's called gesso, a chalky medium, and then working in open air and using the new chemical paints, he applied brush strokes of pure, occasionally unmixed color. Monet ignored the brown underglazes artists traditionally used to build up from. He maintained that there were not lines in nature, so he avoided fixed contours and evoked form by means of color. Instead of blending his colors to create a finished effect, he placed them side by side, rapidly building up a radiant impasto. In order to intensify visual effects, he juxtaposed complementary colors, putting touches of orange, red and yellow, next to blue, and adding bright tints of rose, pink, and vermilion. Monet's canvases captured the external envelope, the instantaneous visual sensations of life itself. Some of his early subjects were street scenes, picnics, cafe life, and boating parties at fashionable tourist resorts along the banks of the River Seine near Paris. After a trip to London, where he studied the works of Constable and Turner, his subjects became haystacks and poplar trees and cathedral facades, obsessively recording these scenes at different times of the day. Some of his later works, ponds and gardens of his estate in Giverny, France, some of the most ravishing paintings in Western history. So here you can see, ponds, right, with the lily pads. You see three different versions of that. The bridge in the Japanese garden, you will see multiple times. Here you see some of the cathedrals that we were talking about and the haystacks. Another famous Impressionist was Pierre Auguste Renoir. And this is one of his pieces, Le Moulin de la Galette, the painter's spontaneity to a celebration of leisure activities. Impressionism was never a single uniform style, but rather the designation, which took its name from Monet's seminal painting, that designation embraced the individual approaches of many different artists in Europe and America. The artists who met regularly at Café Gourbous in Paris, however, had a lot in common. Their paintings reflected Monet's stylistic manner of rendering nature in short strokes of brilliant color. Above all, Impressionism brought painterly spontaneity to a celebration of leisure activities and diversions of urban life. Things like dining or dancing, theater going, boating, and socializing. Pierre Auguste Renoir was the most typical Impressionist painter. Le Moulin de la Galette, an outdoor cafe and dance hall in the Montmartre section of Paris, provided the setting of one of his most seductive tributes to youth and informal pleasure. And that's the painting you see on the slide. In this painting, you see elegantly dressed young men and women, artists, students, and working class members of the Parisian society. They dance, they drink, they flirt with one another in the flickering golden light of that late afternoon sun. Here are some other famous works by Renoir. His works are easily identifiable by their use of bright colors, light-hearted subjects, and bold lines. He was committed to pursuing his own style, and having a dislike for traditional forms, Renoir would collaborate with fellow students, Monet, Sisley, Basile, and together they founded what was called the Impressionist movement. Their style depicted subjects and landscapes naturally, and painting was often held outdoors, which was considered somewhat radical. So here you see one called The Dancer. Here's one at the cafe. The Canoeist Luncheon. Boating at Argenteuil. This is a famous one, the Luncheon of the Boating Party. And in this one, Renoir depicted a number of his close friends, including painters, art dealers, and his future wife, Aline Cherigot, in a smaller, more intimate setting than in a painting like Dance at the Moulin de la Galette, which was filled with people. Though he uses smaller groupings of figures to manage the 14 partygoers and one dog, see, you may not have even noticed the little doggy. He renders the scene without making it feel staged, like a group portrait. Looking beyond the individual subjects of Luncheon, there exists an amount of composition typically foreign to Impressionist canvases. Indeed, in the early 1800s, Renoir began to reintegrate classical notions of composition into his canvases. Here, he used the boat railing to create a diagonal axis from the background to the foreground, gradually making the scene less congested and more full of patterns of light, shadow, and color. Coupled with his intense study of surface, glass, flesh, straw, various textures, is a sweetness in the image of Cherigot smooching at the toy terrier that is representative of the best of his works. All right, so this again was his future wife. Okay, you notice each of them has a hat on. 3 of these are straw hats, but they're very different in style, right? You see it's more congested with people in the back, but moving forward less congested. Just a beautiful piece. Another French artist was Edgar Degas. He was famous for painting, sculpting, printmaking, and drawing. He's regarded as one of the founders of Impressionism, although he rejected that term. He preferred to be called a realist. A superb draftsman, he's especially identified with the subject of dance, and over half of his works depict dancers. These display his mastery in the depiction of movement, as do his race course subjects in female nudes, or raucous subjects, in female nudes. His portraits are considered to be among the finest in the history of art. Early in his career, his ambition was to be a history painter, a calling for which he was well prepared by his rigorous academic training and his close study of classical art. In his early 30s, he changed course and became, and by bringing the traditional methods of a history painter to bear on contemporary subject matter, he became a classical painter of modern life. A famous quote by him: "Painting is easy when you don't know how, but very difficult when you do." Now, this painting is called Two Dancers on Stage. This one, Woman with a Cat. Let's take a look at some others. This one is called Ballet Class, and this is a very famous one where you can, see the ballet teacher here. And you see continuity. They've all got kind of the same outfit on, but they've got different color bows that bring in those bright colors. This one's called Dancer Taking a Bow. That's at the end of the performance. See the flowers. This one's called Four Dancers. This is Blue Dancers. So there's pink dancers. There's almost every color, but dancers were a big focus of his work. So remember Degas by his dancers. Cassatt was an American painter and printmaker. Mary Cassatt lived much of her adult life in France, where she first befriended Edgar Degas and later exhibited among the Impressionists. She created images of the social and private lives of women, with particular emphasis on the intimate bonds between mothers and children. Like Degas, she painted mainly indoor scenes, cultivating a style that captured the momentary effects of light, but also integrated large areas of brilliant color and unusual perspective. Here we have the boating party, mother and child, the bath. That concludes our study of the first part of chapter 13, Materialism. In our next video, we'll talk about post-impressionism and move into modernism's the highlights of chapter 14. Thank you for joining me.